Ji-hoon Kim had received calls that ended lives. Calls that started wars. Calls that made men in 3 countries reach for weapons before they'd finished listening. None of them had ever stopped his breathing. This one did. "The baby," the voice whispered through the phone. "Mr. Kim, it's yours." The penthouse was silent at 3:07 a.m. Not the comfortable silence of a man at rest. Ji-hoon hadn't truly rested in 8 months. This was the silence of a man who had learned to occupy stillness the way a soldier occupies a foxhole, alert, contained, waiting for something he couldn't name. Outside, Seoul blazed 30 floors below. Neon bled across the Han River in long fractured streaks. His empire stretched from those riverbanks to the industrial docks of the east side. 14 years of building something that ran on fear and precision and the particular reputation of a man who never needed to raise his voice to make a room go quiet. Ji-hoon sat at his desk, a glass of untouched whiskey at his right hand, a financial report open on his screen that he hadn't read in 20 minutes. His mind had drifted again. It kept doing that lately. Drifting to things he had no use for. Memories with no strategic value whatsoever. Martha laughing in his kitchen. Martha falling asleep on his shoulder reading a document she'd refused to put down. Martha's eyes, the morning she stopped believing him. His phone lit up. Unknown number. Foreign area code. Ji-hoon studied it for 2 seconds, long enough to register that his instincts were saying answer and short enough that he hadn't yet talked himself out of it. He picked up. "Mr. Kim." The voice was young and unsteady, breathing too fast. "My name is Marvis. I'm Martha's roommate. I know you don't know me. I know she made me swear I'd never contact you, and I kept that promise for 8 months, but tonight the voice fractured. I can't keep it anymore." Ji-hoon's hand tightened around the phone. The name had hit him like a fist to the sternum, quiet, internal, invisible to anyone watching. Martha. The one word in the Korean language, or the English language, or any of the 4 languages he operated in, that still had the power to cut through 14 years of careful armor. "Tell me what happened," he said. His voice was flat. Controlled. The voice he used when control was the only thing standing between him and something he wasn't ready to face. "She collapsed tonight." Marvis was crying now, trying to hide it. "She's at Seoul General Hospital. She's been in labor for 6 hours and the doctors are saying there are complications and she doesn't know I'm calling you. She would be furious with me, but I didn't know what else to." "Marvis." The girl stopped. "The baby," Ji-hoon said. Slowly. Because some sentences needed to be asked one word at a time. "Is it mine?" A silence that lasted exactly long enough to confirm everything. "Yes," Marvis whispered. "She never told you. But it's yours, Mr. Kim. Please come." 8 months ago, Ji-hoon had signed divorce papers at a glass table and he had not let his hand shake. He had watched Martha walk out of that room, straight-backed, dry-eyed, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had already decided that falling apart was a private activity, and he had told himself it was the right thing. That the photographs were real. That she had every reason to leave. That a man like him was not the kind of man a woman like Martha should have to survive. He had spent 8 months believing the lie they had built for him. He was already standing. His coat came off the chair in one motion. His phone stayed pressed to his ear. Which floor, which wing, how serious are the complications? While his other hand found his keys, found the secondary phone, found the familiar weight holstered at his side that never left with him because a man in his position made no assumptions about any hour of any day. He was through the penthouse door before Marvis had finished answering. The elevator was too slow. He took the stairs. His driver was waiting in the underground garage, materializing from the shadows the way he always did, present without being summoned, the particular skill of a man who had worked for Ji-hoon long enough to read the atmosphere of a room from 40 feet away. One look at Ji-hoon's face and he had the engine running before a word was spoken. "Seoul General. Private Wing." Ji-hoon slid into the back of the black car and pulled the door closed. "Don't stop for anything." The city blurred past the windows in ribbons of neon and dark. Ji-hoon sat with his hands flat on his knees, his jaw set, his breathing measured. Controlled. Because if he stopped controlling it, if he let himself feel the full weight of what Marvis had just told him, he was not certain he would be able to walk into that hospital room as the man Martha needed him to be. She had been pregnant. 8 months. The entire length of their divorce, the entire length of his silence, the entire length of all those nights he'd sat in this same penthouse convincing himself she was better off. She had been carrying his child. Alone. The word landed in his chest like something structural giving way. Why? The question came next, inevitable and sharp. Why hadn't she told him? Had she been that certain he wouldn't want it? Had she been that certain he wouldn't come? Something cold moved through him at the thought, followed immediately by something far worse, the recognition that she might have had reasons. Real ones. Reasons he had given her himself, in 14 years of being exactly the kind of man a woman protects a child from. Seoul General rose ahead, all glass and steel and in different light. Ji-hoon stepped out of the car before it fully stopped. Walked through the automatic doors with a kind of presence that rearranged rooms. Nurses looked up, a security guard straightened, the receptionist's hands went very still on her keyboard when she registered his face. Everyone in Seoul knew Ji-hoon Kim's name. Most of them knew better than to look at him too directly. Martha, he said. Labor and delivery. Now. She gave him the floor in 5 seconds. 4th floor. Room 412. He took the stairs again. His mind ran the whole way up, questions multiplying without answers, the particular torture of a man accustomed to knowing everything, finding himself completely, humiliatingly uninformed about the most important thing in his life. His hands curled at his sides. He made himself unclench them. Made himself slow down at the 4th floor door, made himself breathe, made himself remember that whatever was waiting on the other side of room 412 required the steadiest version of him, not the storm, not the empire, not the name that made receptionists freeze. Just the man. Whatever was left of him. He found the room. Through the narrow window in the door, he saw her. Martha. She was sitting up in the hospital bed in a pale blue gown, one hand gripping the bed rail through a contraction, her face angled down, her natural hair pulled back from her face. A young woman, Marvis it had to be, stood close beside her, one hand moving in slow circles on her back, murmuring something Ji-hoon couldn't hear through the glass. He stood there for 3 full seconds. She was more beautiful than he had allowed himself to remember. Even like this, exhausted in pain, 8 months further from the last time he'd seen her, she was the most arresting thing in any room she occupied. And she was doing this alone. Had been doing it alone. The quiet devastation of that image moved through Ji-hoon in one long cold wave. He pushed open the door. Marvis looked up first, her eyes going wide, her hand freezing on Martha's back. And then Martha, following the shift in the room, lifted her eyes. She saw him. Everything crossed her face at once. Shock. Relief she clearly hadn't expected to feel. Something that looked dangerously, heartbreakingly like hope, and behind it, like a shadow behind a flame, the fear of a woman who had learned to survive without the person she was looking at and wasn't sure she remembered how to do anything else. Ji-hoon. His name in her mouth after 8 months of silence. A prayer and a question folded into each other. You came. The disbelief in her voice hit harder than anything that had been done to him in 14 years of navigating one of Seoul's most dangerous worlds. He crossed the room. His hand found her lower back, instinctively, automatically, the body remembering what the mind had spent months trying to bury. He felt her exhale under his touch. I came, he said quietly. I will always come. For one suspended moment, there was nothing else. No empire. No divorce. No 8 months of silence and lies and a child growing in secret. Just the two of them, and the space between them finally, after all this time, beginning to close. Then the door opened behind him. The doctor entered, her expression professionally calm but her eyes sharp, already reading the room, the monitors, the patient, the man standing at her bedside who had clearly arrived with no intention of leaving. We need to talk about the delivery, she said. And whatever Ji-hoon had been about to say to Martha, the questions, the anger, the 8 months of grief that had no language yet, would have to wait. Because right now, his daughter needed to be born. And somewhere across the city, a phone lit up with a single message. Kim is at the hospital. She's in labor. Move now. The doctor's name was Park Soo-yeon, and she had been delivering babies in Seoul General's private wing for 11 years. She had worked through power outages and monsoon floods, and one memorable evening when a sitting government minister had paced her hallway for 4 hours convinced he was having a cardiac event. She was not, by any reasonable measure, a woman who rattled easily. Ji-hoon Kim rattled her. Just slightly. Just enough that she kept her clipboard between them like it meant something. The baby's heart rate has been inconsistent for the past 2 hours, she said, her eyes moving between Ji-hoon and Martha with the practiced efficiency of someone delivering information that needed to land clearly on both sides. We've been monitoring carefully, but given the pattern we're seeing, I want to prepare for a cesarean section. The safest outcome for both mother and child is to move quickly. Martha's hand found the bed rail again. Her knuckles went pale. How quickly? Ji-hoon asked. Within the hour. Possibly sooner. The room contracted around those words. Ji-hoon felt Martha's breathing change beside him, felt the small involuntary shift of a woman absorbing something frightening and deciding immediately to absorb it quietly, without asking for help, the way she absorbed everything. 8 months ago that quality had made him love her more than he knew how to say. Right now it cracked something open in his chest. She'll be fine, he said. Not to reassure her. Because it was the only version of events he was prepared to accept. Martha looked at him sideways. You can't intimidate a medical outcome, Ji-hoon. I'm aware. A pause. I'm working on it. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the muscle memory of a woman who had once found him funny in the moments he wasn't trying to be. It disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Dr. Park cleared her throat. Dad, I'll need you to wait outside while we prep her for. No. The word landed the same way it always landed. Flat. Final. Geological. Dr. Park studied him for a measured moment. Ji-hoon held her gaze with the particular patience of a man who had learned that the most effective way to win a standoff was simply to remain more still than the other person. She made the calculation. You scrub in. You stay at her head. You do not speak to my team unless they speak to you first, and if I tell you to step back, you step back immediately. Are we clear? Completely. She nodded once and moved to prepare. Nurses shifted into motion around the room with the smooth choreography of people who had rehearsed this many times. Ji-hoon turned back to Martha. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read, layered in the way her expressions always were, built in levels, the surface one thing and the depth something else entirely. He had spent 2 years learning to read her. 8 months had not been enough to make him forget. You don't have to stay, she said quietly. Martha. I mean it. I managed this far without. Martha. His voice was gentle this time. Deliberately. I'm staying. She looked away first. And in the looking away, Ji-hoon saw everything she wasn't saying, the relief she didn't want to admit, the exhaustion of 8 months of managing alone, the particular defeat of a strong woman reaching the edge of what strength alone could carry. He reached out and covered her hand with his. She didn't pull away. Marvis appeared in the doorway just as the nurses began moving Martha's bed toward the operating corridor. She caught Ji-hoon's eye and tilted her head toward the hallway, a small urgent gesture, the look of someone carrying information they could no longer hold. Ji-hoon held up one finger. He leaned close to Martha. I'll be right behind you, he said. 60 seconds. Martha's eyes searched his face. Whatever she found there was enough. She nodded. He stepped into the hallway. Marvis was small and composed in the way of someone who had been crying recently and had decided to be finished with it for now. She was maybe 25, with careful eyes and the posture of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as was necessary and no more. She had called him tonight against direct instructions from the woman she clearly loved like a sister. Ji-hoon filed that away. Talk fast, he said. Marvis pulled out her phone. Her hands were steady as she opened a message thread and held the screen out to him. The photographs, she said. The ones Martha received. The ones that ended your marriage. Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. What about them? They were fabricated. The corridor was very quiet. Ji-hoon took the phone. The message thread was long weeks of communication, carefully screenshotted and assembled, the kind of documentation a methodical person builds when they've been sitting on something dangerous and need it to be undeniable when the moment comes. He read quickly, the way he read everything, processing in the efficient cold manner of a man trained to extract critical information from noise. The name at the top of the thread stopped him. Kwang-soo Lim. Ji-hoon didn't move for 3 full seconds. Kwang-soo Lim. His former second. The man who had sat at his right hand for 7 years, who had eaten at his table, who had been trusted with the architecture of Ji-hoon's entire operation, until Ji-hoon had discovered 2 years ago that he'd been quietly siphoning money into competing networks, hedging his loyalty against a future where Ji-hoon might fall. Ji-hoon had removed him. Cleanly. Without violence, which in retrospect had clearly been interpreted as weakness. He kept reading. The messages detailed everything. The hired woman. The hotel room. The doctored images delivered to Martha's apartment at a time calculated for maximum damage. A Sunday evening, when Martha would be home alone, when Ji-hoon was traveling, when the distance between them would give the photographs time to work on her before he could counter them. The paid witnesses placed on standby in case she demanded confirmation. The entire operation assembled with the patience and precision of someone who had spent months building a trap and knew exactly which door to leave unlocked. They knew her, Ji-hoon thought. They knew how she thought. They knew she wouldn't come to me first. They knew she'd absorb the evidence alone and make her decision before I had a chance to. There's a second name, Mavis said quietly. Ji-hoon scrolled down. Hoon Jang. He knew that name too, though differently. Martha's ex-boyfriend from before Seoul. The man she had left a life in another city to get distance from, a controlling, calculating man who had apparently never reconciled himself to the fact that she had left, and had never forgiven Ji-hoon for being what she'd found on the other side of that distance. Ji-hoon had dealt with him once, early in their marriage, when Jang had made contact in ways that required a response. He had assumed the matter was concluded. He had assumed incorrectly. They worked together, Mavis said. Kwang-soo needed your marriage destroyed to weaken you. Jang needed Martha isolated. They wanted the same outcome for different reasons, so she stopped. Swallowed. They built it together. The whole thing. From the photographs to the witnesses to, Ji-hoon found her. Her voice dropped. In the months after the divorce. He found where she was living. He's been watching her. The hallway went very, very cold. He knows she's pregnant, Mavis continued, and now her composure was showing its fault lines, the careful calm developing fractures. I don't know what he's planning to do with that. But he knows. And Kwang-soo, your man sent me a warning 2 days ago. I don't know how he got my number. The message said that if I contacted you, Martha would. She stopped again. I contacted you anyway. Ji-hoon handed her phone back. He stood for a moment in the corridor with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the middle distance and the full shape of the last 8 months rearranging itself inside him into something new and precise and completely, devastatingly clear. They had taken his marriage. Systematically. Deliberately. They had isolated Martha, watched her through a pregnancy she'd hidden out of fear, and now, on the night their child was fighting to be born, someone had sent a message telling him to move. His phone buzzed. He already knew what it would say before he looked. His head of security. 3 words. Boss. We have a problem. Ji-hoon typed back 2. I know. Then he typed 4 more. Lock down the hospital. He looked up at Mavis. She was watching him with the expression of someone trying to determine whether they had just made things significantly better or significantly worse. You did the right thing, he told her. Calling me. Something in her shoulders released. She's going to be furious with me, Mavis said. Yes, Ji-hoon agreed. She is. He straightened his coat. Turned toward the operating corridor where his daughter was about to enter the world and his ex-wife, his wife, was doing it without him for the last time in her life. Go back inside with her, he said. Tell her I'm coming. Tell her, he paused. Tell her she's not alone anymore. Mavis nodded and disappeared through the doors. Ji-hoon stayed in the corridor for exactly 10 more seconds. Long enough to pull out his secondary phone and make 2 calls that would, by morning, set an irreversible sequence of events into motion across 4 districts of Seoul. Kwang-soo Lim had spent 2 years building a trap. He had approximately 12 hours before Ji-hoon Kim finished dismantling it around him. Ji-hoon pocketed the phone. Walked to the scrub sink. Pulled on the sterile gown with the practiced efficiency of a man who adapted to every environment required of him. Pushed through the operating room doors. Martha was already on the table, the epidural in, her eyes open and tracking the ceiling with the focused calm of someone managing fear through sheer discipline. She turned her head when he entered. He crossed to her. Took her hand. I'm here, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then quietly, Ji-hoon. The photographs. I know, he said. Her breath caught. You know? I know everything. He held her gaze steadily. We'll talk about all of it. But not right now. His thumb moved across the back of her hand. Right now I just need you to let me stay. Martha looked at him, this man who had walked back through the door she'd closed, who was standing in a hospital gown in the most vulnerable room she'd ever been in, holding her hand without conditions, and whatever decision she'd been carrying alone for 8 months quietly, finally shifted. Okay, she said. Dr. Park's voice came from behind the sterile drape. Calm. Precise. We're beginning. Ji-hoon didn't look away from Martha's face. He had spent 14 years building an empire on the premise that nothing could touch him. Tonight he was discovering exactly how wrong he had been, and finding, beneath the wreckage of that certainty, something he hadn't expected. Something worth far more than being untouchable. Stay with me, Martha whispered. Always, he said. And meant it for the first time in 8 months. Outside the hospital, on the rain-slicked street below, a black car sat idling at the far end of the car park. Inside it, a phone lit up. A man read the update, set the phone down, and told his driver to move closer. Kwang-soo Lim had not come to watch. He had come to finish it. She arrived at 4:23 in the morning. No announcement. No ceremony. Just the sudden, furious, magnificent fact of her, a sound that cut through the operating room's clinical silence like something the world had been holding its breath for. Sharp and strong and absolutely certain of itself, the cry of a child who had decided, against considerable odds and at considerable inconvenience to everyone present, that she intended to be here. Ji-hoon Kim, who had faced armed men without flinching, who had sat across negotiating tables from people who wanted him dead and drunk his coffee anyway, who had built 14 years of reputation on the foundational principle that nothing reached him. Completely, entirely, stopped functioning. It's a girl, Dr. Park announced, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who had delivered this specific sentence hundreds of times and still meant it every single time. Ji-hoon looked at his daughter. She was small in a way that rearranged his understanding of the word. Dark-skinned and furious, her face creased with the effort of existing, her fists already clenched like she was prepared to argue with anyone who had opinions about her arrival. A full crown of black hair. Lungs that were, beyond any medical doubt, in perfect working order. Ji-hoon. Martha's voice, raw and wondering, pulled him back. She was craning to see past the drape, tears tracking freely down her face with the uncomplicated abandon of a woman too exhausted and too overwhelmed to manage them. Is she? Tell me she's okay. She's okay, he said. His voice came out entirely wrong. Too low. Too unsteady. The voice of a man who had not yet located the register appropriate for this moment because no register in his existing vocabulary had been built for it. She's perfect, he added. Because that was the more accurate word. The nurses moved with swift efficiency, clearing her airway, warming her, performing the rapid quiet assessment of newborn life with practiced hands. Ji-hoon watched every second of it. Watched the tiny chest rise and fall. Watched the fists uncurl slightly and curl again. Watched his daughter decide in real time that the world was loud and cold and she had strong feelings about both. Then they placed her on Martha's chest. Martha's hands came up before the nurses had even finished the motion, instinctive, certain, the hands of a woman who had been waiting for this specific moment for 8 months and knew exactly what to do with it. She held her daughter against her heartbeat and closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again she was somewhere Ji-hoon couldn't follow. Somewhere private and complete. He didn't try to follow. He just stayed beside her, his hands still covering hers, and understood for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to be in the presence of something that outranked everything he had ever built. Naomi, Martha whispered. The name settling into the room like it had always belonged there. Ji-hoon looked at the child. At the small face turning instinctively toward her mother's warmth. At the fingers, impossibly small, architecturally perfect, curled against Martha's hospital gown. Naomi, he repeated quietly. It was the only word he said for the next 4 minutes. It was enough. The nurse was completing her assessment, 7 pounds, 9 ounces, all indicators strong, when Ji-hoon's phone vibrated against the scrub table where he'd left it. He didn't move immediately. He gave himself the 4 minutes. He had earned 4 minutes. Then he picked it up. 3 messages. All from Taeyong, his head of security. Sent at 2-minute intervals with the escalating urgency of a man trained not to escalate unless the situation genuinely required it. Lower-level parking. 2 vehicles. Not ours. 4 men confirmed. Armed. Moving towards service entrance. Ji-hoon. They're inside. The operating room didn't change. The monitors kept their rhythm. The nurses moved with the same calm efficiency. Martha was still looking at Naomi with that expression that belonged to no one else. Nothing in the room knew what Ji-hoon now knew. He kept his face exactly as it was. He typed back, "How many total?" The response came in seconds. "Minimum 6. Possibly more in the vehicles. Contain them below. Nothing reaches the 4th floor. I need 10 minutes. Understood." Ji-hoon set the phone face down and looked at his daughter for approximately 30 more seconds. He catalogued her face with the thoroughness of a man who understood that some moments needed to be memorized completely in real time because later would be too late. The shape of her nose. The specific darkness of her skin in the operating room light. The way her fingers had found Martha's and held on. Then he stood up. Martha noticed immediately. She always had, that particular attunement to him that had existed from the first months of their relationship, the way she registered shifts in his atmosphere before he'd consciously produced them. Her eyes came up from Naomi's face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing that concerns you right now. Ji-hoon." Her voice was quiet but exact. The tone she used when she required the truth rather than the managed version of it. He met her eyes. Made the calculation that every operating room and every hospital gown and every exhausted new mother deserved the calculation he was about to make, which was to tell her enough to prepare her without telling her enough to terrify her. "There are people in this building who shouldn't be here," he said. "My men are handling it. You and Naomi are not going to be touched. I need you to trust me for the next hour." Martha looked at him for a long moment. He could see her processing it, the fear arriving and being assessed and being placed, with the methodical calm that had always distinguished her, into the appropriate category of things she could not control and therefore would not waste energy catastrophizing about. "Go," she said. "I'll be back before she needs a name for me." Something crossed Martha's face. Not quite a smile. Something older and more complicated than a smile. "She already has one," Martha said quietly. "She's known it for months." Ji-hoon held that sentence for exactly as long as he could afford to. Then he pressed his lips to Martha's forehead, brief and certain, and walked out of the operating room. The corridor outside was different from the one he'd left. Taeyong was already there, compact and expressionless in a dark jacket, his phone in his hand, his eyes doing the constant ambient scan of a man paid to notice things before they became problems. Beside him stood 2 of Ji-hoon's personal security team, positioned with the casual-looking deliberateness of people who were actually covering both directions of the hallway simultaneously. "Report," Ji-hoon said, pulling the scrub gown off as he walked. Taeyong fell into step beside him. 6 confirmed inside. They came through the loading dock on the basement level, disabled the service camera 30 minutes before they moved, which means they had someone with access to the building's security schedule. "Inside man. Has to be." They knew the camera rotation, knew the shift change, knew which entrance would be unwatched. This wasn't improvised. Ji-hoon absorbed this without breaking stride. "Where are they now?" 2 are contained in the basement. Ryu and Park intercepted them at the stairwell. 2 more are on the 2nd floor, and we're tracking them. The last 2, Taeyong's jaw tightened slightly. "We lost them briefly near the east elevator bank." Ji-hoon stopped walking. Taeyong stopped with him. "Lost them," Ji-hoon said. "For approximately 4 minutes. We've reacquired one. The 2nd is still." Ji-hoon was already moving back toward the 4th floor corridor, his hand finding his phone, dialing before the thought had fully formed. The line connected on the 2nd ring. "There's a man loose on an upper floor," he said. "Room 412. No one enters that room. No one stands near that door. If anyone approaches that room who is not wearing a hospital badge you personally recognize, you put them on the ground. I don't care what it looks like." He ended the call. Kept moving. "Who's on the inside?" he asked Taeyong. "Who gave them the security schedule?" "We're working on it." But Ji-hoon, Taeyong said his name in a particular way, the way he only used it when the information he was carrying was the kind that changed the shape of things. "There's something else." The 2 men we contained in the basement. We ran their faces. And they're not Kwang Soo's regular crew. Ji-hoon looked at him. They're Hoon Jang's, Taeyong said. The hallway went very still around that information. Ji-hoon had known Jang was connected to this. Marvis's phone had confirmed the alliance between Jang and Kwang Soo, the two-headed conspiracy that had dismantled his marriage from both sides simultaneously. What he hadn't known, what was now becoming sharply, dangerously clear, was that the division of labor between them was more specific than he'd assumed. Kwang Soo wanted Ji-hoon's empire. Hoon Jang wanted Martha. He's not here for me, Ji-hoon said. Not a question. No, Taeyong confirmed. The men we took down, they had a photograph. Martha. Her hospital room number. A specific instruction. He paused. Take the woman. Leave the child. Something happened to the air in Ji-hoon's chest. It wasn't fear. Fear was too simple a word for it. It was older than fear. More fundamental. The thing that lives underneath fear in the part of a person that has never been entirely civilized, the part that predates 14 years of empire and reputation and careful calculation. The part that had been dormant in Ji-hoon Kim for a very long time. It woke up now. Find the 6th man, Ji-hoon said. His voice had changed. Taeyong heard it, registered it with a slight shift in his own posture, the reflexive recalibration of a man who knew what that particular tone meant for everyone it was directed at. Find him in the next 5 minutes and bring him to me. And get Kwang Soo's location. I want to know exactly where he is right now. Already working on it. Work faster. Ji-hoon turned the corner onto the 4th floor corridor. 2 of his men stood outside room 412, positioned with the understated efficiency of people who were very good at their jobs. One of them nodded as Ji-hoon approached. The hallway was quiet. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm behind closed doors. He stood outside the room for a moment. Through the window, he could see that Martha had been transferred back from the operating suite, Naomi now in the small hospital crib beside the bed. Marvis was in the chair in the corner, asleep, sitting up with her arms folded and her head tipped back, the exhausted unconsciousness of a woman who had been running on adrenaline for 6 hours and had finally run out. Martha's eyes were closed. She looked, for the first time since Ji-hoon had walked into this hospital, at rest. He stood at the window and watched her breathe for a moment. Watched Naomi's chest rise and fall in the crib beside her. The 2 of them, separated from everything outside this room by a door, and 2 of his men and whatever was still moving through the floors below. Someone had sent men to take Martha and leave the child. The sentence moved through him slowly, completely, the way something toxic moves through water. He thought about Martha, 8 months ago, making the decision alone in a bathroom somewhere with a pregnancy test in her hand and a divorce that was 6 weeks old. He thought about her deciding that silence was protection. That disappearing was the safest thing she could do for the child they'd made. He thought about how wrong she had been, not because she'd misjudged the danger, but because she hadn't known the danger was already inside her life before Ji-hoon had ever been removed from it. Hoon Jang had been watching her. Had probably been watching her since before the divorce. Had used her isolation, the isolation that Kwang Soo's fabricated photographs had created, to move closer. Had known about the pregnancy. Had been sitting on that knowledge, waiting for the right moment to use it. The right moment, apparently, was tonight. Ji-hoon's phone buzzed. Taeyong, 6th man found. Basement storage. He's talking. Ji-hoon typed back, I'll be down in 2 minutes. He looked through the window one more time. Martha. Naomi. The small perfect fact of them, resting in the blue-gray light of a hospital room at 4:47 in the morning, entirely unaware of what was being built around them in the floors below. Not for much longer, Ji-hoon thought. He turned from the window. Walked toward the stairwell. His hands were loose at his sides and his face was composed and his eyes were the particular quality of still that the people who worked for him had learned, over 14 years, to recognize as the most dangerous version of him. Not the storm. Not the raised voice. Not the visible anger. This. The stillness that came when Ji-hoon Kim had made a decision that he intended to see through to its absolute conclusion, regardless of what it cost. Kwang Soo Lim had spent 2 years building toward this night. Hoon Jang had spent longer than that. They were both about to discover that the thing they had miscalculated, the fundamental error at the center of every plan they had made, was the same thing people always miscalculated about Ji-hoon Kim. They had assumed that destroying his marriage had made him weaker. They had not considered what it would mean when it made him free. Upstairs, in room 412, Naomi Kim made a small sound in her sleep. Martha's hand moved automatically to the crib rail, fingers curling around it, even in unconsciousness. Holding on. Neither of them knew that 4 floors below, the man who intended to spend the rest of his life making sure they never had to hold on alone was already in motion. And God help anyone who got in his way. The basement storage room smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and old concrete. It was not, by any standard, an interrogation room. There was no table, no single hanging light, none of the architectural theater that the movies attached to moments like this one. There was a metal shelving unit stacked with supply boxes, a bare bulb in a wire cage overhead, and a man zip-tied to a maintenance chair who was doing a very poor job of pretending he wasn't afraid. Ji-hoon walked in and closed the door behind him. He didn't speak immediately. He crossed to the shelving unit opposite the man, leaned against it with his arms folded, and simply looked. It was a technique he had developed early, the understanding that silence, applied with precision, extracted more information than any question. People filled silence. They couldn't help it. The gap between what they knew and what they hadn't yet been asked became unbearable faster than they expected, and they rushed to close it with words they hadn't planned to say. The man lasted 40 seconds. "I was just a driver," he said. "I don't know the full operation. They don't tell drivers the full." "You're not a driver," Ji-hoon said. "Drivers wait in vehicles. You were inside the building with a photograph of a specific woman and a room number written on your forearm in blue ink, which means you were given a target and a location and an instruction, and the instruction was not to park the car." The man's mouth closed. "So let's skip the part where you tell me what you're not," Ji-hoon continued, his voice conversational, almost pleasant, which everyone in the room understood to be the least reassuring version of him. "And move directly to what I actually need from you, which is a precise account of tonight's operation. Who gave the orders? What the full objective was? And where Hoon Jang is right now." The man looked at the 2 figures standing behind Ji-hoon, Taeyong and one other, both of them still and watchful in the way of people who were very comfortable in rooms like this one. "If I talk," the man said slowly, "Jang will." "Hoon Jang," Ji-hoon said, "is currently my problem to manage. What happens to you if you don't talk is a different problem entirely, and it is one that will resolve itself in the next several minutes regardless of what Jang does or doesn't do. I'd encourage you to make the calculation that serves you best." A long pause. Then the man talked. It came out in pieces, the way confessions always did, the speaker's mind moving faster than their mouth, assembling and discarding, deciding in real time what to offer and what to hold back, recalibrating constantly against Ji-hoon's expression for signs of whether the offering was sufficient. Ji-hoon listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that interruption gave the speaker time to think, and thinking produced editing, and editing produced the managed version of the truth rather than the functional one. The operation, as the man laid it out, had 2 distinct phases. Phase 1 belonged to Kwang-soo. It was the larger strategic play, a coordinated strike against 3 of Ji-hoon's key distribution territories, timed to begin at 5 a.m. while Ji-hoon was occupied at the hospital. The hospital itself was never Kwang-soo's primary target. It was a distraction. Send enough men to create noise, occupy Ji-hoon's security resources, keep his attention fragmented while the real move happened elsewhere in the city. Ji-hoon filed this and kept listening. Phase 2 was Jang's. And Phase 2 was considerably more specific. "Jang's been inside the hospital since before you arrived," the man said. He was looking at the floor now. The practiced eye contact of someone trying to demonstrate cooperation had given way to the genuine avoidance of someone who understood that the information they were delivering was going to produce a reaction they didn't want directed at them. "He came in 3 hours before we did. Different entrance. He's been here the whole time." The temperature in the room didn't change. Ji-hoon's expression didn't change. "How?" Ji-hoon said. "Staff credentials. He's been planning this for months. He had someone on the inside, someone who works the night shift in the East Wing. They got him a badge, a set of scrubs. He's been," the man stopped. "Finish the sentence." "He's been on the 4th floor," the man said. "On and off for the last 2 hours. Waiting." Ji-hoon looked at Taeyong. Taeyong was already on his phone. "Waiting for what specifically?" Ji-hoon said. His voice had not changed in pitch or volume or temperature. This was the thing people never understood about him, the stillness wasn't control over anger. It was something underneath anger. Something colder and more patient and considerably more dangerous than anger had ever been. "For you to leave the floor," the man said quietly. Jiang said, "He said the boss always leaves. That you'd get a call, or your men would pull you out, and you'd go handle the operation and leave the woman with minimal cover. He said you always chose the empire over the personal. That it was the most predictable thing about you." The room absorbed this. Ji-hoon stood very still for approximately 5 seconds. Then he turned to Taeyong. "4th floor. Now. Every room, every corridor, every stairwell exit. Find him." Taeyong was already moving, phone to his ear, speaking in the clipped shorthand of someone coordinating multiple people simultaneously. The door swung shut behind him. Ji-hoon looked back at the man in the chair. "The inside contact," he said. "The hospital employee who gave Jiang the credentials. Name?" "I don't. Name?" "Lee," the man said. "That's all I have. Lee something. Works the East Wing night desk." Ji-hoon nodded once. Pushed off the shelving unit. Walked to the door. "What happens to me now?" the man asked behind him. Ji-hoon paused with his hand on the door frame. "That depends entirely on whether everything you just told me is accurate," he said. "If it is, you'll spend a very uncomfortable night in this room and someone will make arrangements for you in the morning. A beat. If it isn't, you won't spend the night anywhere." He walked out. He took the stairwell at a pace that was technically not running. The distinction mattered to him less than it usually did. 4th floor. Jiang had been on the 4th floor for 2 hours, waiting for Ji-hoon to leave. Which Ji-hoon had done, 20 minutes ago, when he'd walked down to the basement, when the 2 men outside room 412 had been his only coverage, when Martha and Naomi were sleeping and Marvis was unconscious in the corner chair and the corridor outside was as quiet as a corridor in a building with 6 armed intruders could reasonably be. 20 minutes. He hit the 4th floor door at full stride, pushed through into the corridor. Both his men were still outside room 412. That was the first thing he checked. Both present, both alert, neither of them displaying the particular quality of stillness that suggested anything had gone wrong in his absence. He crossed to them in 8 steps. "Anyone approach the room?" 2 nurses, both badged, both known to the floor staff, one of them said. "One doctor doing rounds," verified. "No one else." "A man. Scrubs, hospital badge, East Wing credentials. Have you seen him anywhere on this floor in the last 2 hours?" Both of them exchanged a look that Ji-hoon didn't like. "There was someone," the second man said carefully. "About 40 minutes ago. East end of the corridor. We flagged him as staff, he had a badge, he was moving like he knew the floor. He didn't approach the room." "Where did he go?" "He went," the man turned and looked toward the east end of the corridor. "The family waiting area. Around the corner." Ji-hoon was already moving. The family waiting area at the east end of the 4th floor was a small, deliberately neutral space, 4 chairs, a low table, a window overlooking the side street below. It was also, Ji-hoon noted as he turned the corner, positioned with a direct sight line to the corridor outside room 412. From the chair nearest the window, a person could watch that door for hours without being visible from either direction of the main hallway. The chair was empty, but the window was open. Ji-hoon stood at it. Looked down at the side street 4 floors below, the rain-wet pavement, the orange circles of street lamps, the dark mouth of the alley that ran alongside the building's east wall. Empty. A fire escape ladder descended from the 2nd floor, recently disturbed, a small drift of rust flakes on the windowsill, the kind of detail that only registered if you were looking for it. Jiang had been here. Had watched the corridor. Had watched the door. Had been waiting for Ji-hoon to leave the floor entirely, not just step out, but leave the building, pull his men to handle the operation below. Had been 30 meters and a single corner away from Martha's room for the better part of an hour. And then something had changed his calculation. Ji-hoon looked at the fire escape. At the open window. Jiang had left in a hurry, not through the corridor, not through any exit his men would have been watching, but out and down and into the alley before the net fully closed. He'd known Ji-hoon was coming back. Ji-hoon pulled out his phone. Called Taeyong. "He's gone. East alley, fire escape, probably 10 to 20 minutes ago. Get eyes on every exit route from the east side of the building." Check traffic cameras on Namdi Manaro and the two side streets. On it. A pause. Ji-hoon. Kwang-soo's location just came in. Where? Gangnam. A building he owns through a shell company. We've had it flagged for 8 months but never had cause to move on it. He's there now, at least 4 armed men with him. He's been there all night. Ji-hoon processed this. Kwang-soo directing from a distance, Jang handling the personal operation. The division was clean, deliberate. Kwang-soo was too careful to be anywhere near a hospital with 6 armed men running loose inside it. He was the architect. Jang was the instrument. Keep the building under watch, Ji-hoon said. Nothing moves on it until I say. I want him to feel safe until the moment he isn't. And Jang. Find him. Ji-hoon looked out the open window at the empty alley below. He ran tonight because he ran out of time. Which means he'll rebuild the plan and try again. I want to know where he goes when he needs to think, where he sleeps, where he eats, who he contacts in the next 12 hours. I want every movement. Understood. Ji-hoon ended the call. He stood at the window for a moment longer. The city outside was beginning its slow transition from night to early morning, the sky at the eastern edge faintly, almost imperceptibly lighter than it had been an hour ago. Seoul waking up around the edges, the way it always did, indifferent to whatever had happened in its hours of darkness. Somewhere out there Hoon Jang was moving through those streets, recalculating, rebuilding, driven by the particular obsession of a man who had never accepted that Martha had chosen to leave him and had spent years constructing elaborate justifications for why that choice didn't count. Ji-hoon had encountered men like Jang before, men who wrapped obsession in the language of love, who genuinely believed their persistence was devotion rather than control, who could not distinguish between wanting someone and believing they were owed them. They were, in Ji-hoon's experience, the most dangerous kind of enemy precisely because they didn't think of themselves as enemies at all. He turned from the window and walked back down the corridor to room 412. Both his men were in position. He nodded to them and pushed open the door quietly. The room was exactly as he'd left it. Naomi in the crib, her small chest rising and falling with the total commitment to breathing that newborns brought to everything. Marvis still asleep in the corner, head tipped back. And Martha. Martha was awake. She was lying on her side facing the crib, one hand extended through the rail bars with her fingers resting lightly against Naomi's back, not gripping, just touching, the way a person maintains contact with something precious while they sleep. She wasn't sleeping. Her eyes were open and tracking Ji-hoon as he entered, and in them was the clear evidence that she had been awake for some time and had been thinking hard about things she hadn't said yet. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. For a moment neither of them spoke. The monitors kept their quiet rhythm. Naomi breathed. How bad is it? Martha asked. No preamble. No softening. She had always done this, asked the question she actually needed the answer to, without the protective layer of asking something easier first. It had been one of the first things he had loved about her. It's manageable, he said. That's not an answer. It's the answer that's true right now. He held her gaze. By tomorrow it will be resolved. Martha was quiet for a moment. Her fingers moved slightly against Naomi's back. Marvis told me. About the photographs. She said it without looking away from him. She told me what she showed you in the hallway. Ji-hoon nodded. I believed them, Martha said. The words came out steady, but he could hear the thing underneath them, the particular weight of a person confronting a decision that cannot be undone. I saw those photographs and I believed them completely. I didn't even, she stopped. I didn't ask you to explain. I just decided. Martha. I'm not asking for absolution, she said. I'm telling you that I know what I did. I took the evidence I was given and I used it to confirm the fear I already had, which was that your world would eventually consume us. The photographs gave me a reason to do what part of me had already been considering. She paused. That's not nothing. That's something I have to own. Ji-hoon looked at her in the low light of the hospital room. At the exhaustion in her face and the honesty in her eyes and the hand still resting against their daughter's back. They knew that, he said quietly. Kwang-soo knew you. He knew how you thought. He designed the photographs around the specific fear you already carried because a generic betrayal story wouldn't have been enough. He needed something that fit the shape of what you were already afraid of. That's not a coincidence. That's targeting. Martha absorbed this. He studied me, she said slowly. For months. Possibly longer. A long silence. And Hoon Jang, Martha said. His name in her mouth carrying a different weight, older, heavier, the weight of something she'd spent years putting distance between herself and. He's involved. Yes. Her jaw tightened. Of course he is. Not surprise. Something wearier than surprise. The recognition of a woman confronting the information that someone she'd escaped had simply kept following at a distance she couldn't see. What does he want? Ji-hoon considered how much of the basement conversation to carry into this room. Looked at Martha, post-surgery, 8 hours into new motherhood, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical, and made the decision that she was owed the truth and capable of receiving it. He came here tonight for you, he said. Not for me. Kwang-soo's operation was a distraction. Jang's objective was to take you out of this building. The room was very still. Naomi. Martha's voice was carefully controlled. Was not part of his plan. Something moved through Martha's expression, something cold and clarifying, the particular quality of a woman who had just received information that reorganized her understanding of her own situation from the ground up. Her hand on Naomi's back didn't move. But something in her posture shifted, the last residue of exhausted vulnerability replaced by something considerably more durable. Where is he now? She asked. Gone. He left the building before my men closed the floor. But you'll find him. It wasn't a question. She was looking at him with the direct certainty of someone who had just remembered, with complete clarity, exactly who they were talking to. Yes, Ji-hoon said. And Kwang-soo. Also yes. Martha held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back at Naomi. At the small face turned sideways in sleep, entirely unbothered, entirely perfect, entirely unaware of the war that had arranged itself around her arrival. I hid her from you, Martha said quietly. I told myself it was to protect her. And it was. But it was also, she stopped. Started again. It was also because I was afraid that if you knew, you'd want to be involved. And I didn't know yet if I could trust what that involvement would look like. Ji-hoon didn't flinch from it. That was fair, he said. Martha looked at him sharply. That was fair, he repeated. Given what you believed about me. Given what they built for you to believe. You were protecting her the only way you knew how with the information you had. A pause. I'm not angry about the choice. I'm angry that you were put in a position where that was the only choice that felt safe. Martha looked at him for a long time. That's a very considered response for a man who found out an hour ago that he has a daughter, she said. I've had an hour to consider it. The ghost of something crossed her face again, that almost smile, that muscle memory of a version of them that had existed before the photographs, before the divorce, before 8 months of parallel silence. It lasted slightly longer this time before it faded. What happens now? She asked. Ji-hoon looked at Naomi. At the impossible fact of her, sleeping with absolute confidence in the safety of her crib, trusting without knowing she was trusting that the world she'd arrived in would hold her. Now, he said, you and Naomi don't go back to your apartment. You come somewhere I can secure properly while I finish this. Ji-hoon. I'm not asking you to come back to me, he said carefully. I'm asking you to let me keep you safe while there are people in this city who see you as leverage. Those are two separate things. You can decide about the first one later, when this is over and you've slept and we've had the conversations we actually need to have. But the second one isn't negotiable. Martha was quiet. Outside the window, Seoul was fully gray now with the approach of early morning. The night had broken without either of them noticing. Where? Martha asked finally. Ji-hoon thought of the mountain estate. The house he'd bought the year they married and never sold. The room he'd sat in alone during the worst months of the divorce, the crib that had appeared there with the particular speed of a man who had told his staff to prepare a room for a child before he'd fully allowed himself to understand why. Somewhere I should have taken you a long time ago, he said. Martha looked at him. Then she looked at Naomi. Then she looked back at him with the expression of a woman who was tired of carrying everything alone and had just been offered, by the one person she'd spent 8 months refusing to need, a reason to put some of it down. Okay, she said quietly. But Ji-hoon. Whatever you're about to make me promise, he said, I'll keep it. She held his gaze. Come back, she said. Whatever you have to do tonight, come back. Ji-hoon stood, looked at his daughter one more time, then at the woman who had carried her alone through 8 months of silence and fear and stubborn extraordinary love. I'll always come back, he said. That's the one promise I should have made first. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. Taeyong will be outside this room until I return. No one enters without your permission. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you tell him immediately. Martha nodded. Ji-hoon stepped into the corridor, pulled the door closed behind him, stood for a moment in the quiet hallway with the soft beep of monitors and the gray morning light beginning to push through the window at the far end. Kwang-soo was in Gangnam, feeling safe in a building he thought Ji-hoon didn't know about. Hoon Jang was somewhere in the city, rebuilding a plan that Ji-hoon had just interrupted. Both of them had made the same fundamental error. They had looked at the divorce, at the 8 months of silence, at the apparent distance between Ji-hoon and everything that made him human, and they had concluded that he was weakened. That the man who had lost his wife was less than the man who had her. They had it exactly backwards. The man who had nothing to lose had been dangerous. The man who had just found everything he'd been missing. Ji-hoon straightened his coat, walked toward the stairwell. That man was something else entirely. In room 412, Martha pulled her hand back through the crib rail and lay back against the pillow. Naomi slept on, undisturbed. And in the corner, Marvis opened one eye. He's going to be okay, Marvis said quietly, to no one in particular. Martha stared at the ceiling. I know, she said. A pause. That's what worries me. Dawn came to Seoul the way it always did in early spring. Not all at once. Not with any particular announcement. Just a slow gray insistence at the edges of the sky, the darkness thinning incrementally, the city's neon bleeding out, the streets below Seoul General taking on the flat, honest light of a morning that had no interest in being dramatic about itself. Ji-hoon had been awake for 26 hours. He stood in the hospital corridor outside room 412 while the transfer was prepared, wheelchair for Martha despite her objections, a carry basket for Naomi, Marvis moving with quiet efficiency between the room and the hallway, packing the few things Martha had arrived with into a bag that Taeyong had produced from somewhere without being asked. 3 of Ji-hoon's cars were positioned at the hospital's private exit on the south side of the building. 4 more men had arrived in the last hour, drawn in from positions across the city as the threat assessment shifted from the hospital to the route ahead. Ji-hoon had not told Martha how many people were now involved in moving her from one building to another. She would find out eventually. She always found out everything eventually, which had been one of the more consistently humbling features of being married to her. For now he was focused on the mechanics, the route, the timing, the specific sequence of movements that would get his daughter and her mother into a vehicle and out of Seoul Center before the city woke up fully and complicated everything. His phone buzzed. Taeyong. South exit is clear. Vehicles in position. We can move in 5. Ji-hoon typed back, 2 minutes. He pushed open the door to room 412. Martha was already in the wheelchair, which she was sitting in with the posture of someone who had accepted a necessity while maintaining firm reservations about it. Naomi was in Marvis's arms, wrapped in the white hospital blanket with the focused unconsciousness of someone who had made peace with being transported. Martha had changed out of the hospital gown into the clothes Marvis had apparently thought to bring: dark trousers, a soft gray top, flat shoes. Her natural hair was down now, loose around her face. She looked at Ji-hoon when he entered. He looked at her. 8 months. A hospital. A daughter born at 4:23 in the morning. A conspiracy assembled by people who had bet everything on the calculation that Ji-hoon Kim loved his empire more than he loved the woman sitting in front of him. Ready, he said. Martha held his gaze for a moment. You look terrible, she said. I've been told. When did you last sleep? I'll sleep when this is over. She studied him with the particular assessment of a woman recalibrating her understanding of a person she thought she knew in full. Then she nodded once. Let's go. The convoy moved through Seoul's early morning streets with the smooth, deliberate efficiency of people who had planned the route 3 times and driven it once before moving anyone. Ji-hoon sat beside Martha in the middle vehicle, Naomi in the carry basket secured between them, Marvis on Martha's other side. Taeyong rode in the lead car. 2 more vehicles followed at intervals designed to look like ordinary morning traffic to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Martha watched the city pass outside the window. Ji-hoon watched Martha. He wasn't sure she was fully aware of it, the way her eyes moved across the Seoul streetscape with the particular attention of someone memorizing something they're not certain they'll see again. She had built a life here, he reminded himself. Not the life they'd had together, something smaller and more careful, an apartment with Marvis, a work contract, a daily route between places that held no connection to him. She had made herself a soul that didn't include Ji-hoon Kim. He was, in the space of one night, rearranging that completely. "The place we're going," Martha said, without turning from the window. "Tell me about it." "Mountains. 40 minutes outside the city. Traditional architecture, modern security. Gardens." He paused. "Quiet. Is it yours?" "Yes." "Have I been there before?" "No." She turned from the window then, looked at him with the direct, undeflectable quality that had always made him feel, uniquely in his experience, that he was being read rather than observed. "Why not? We were married for 2 years. I was waiting for the right time." He held her gaze. "I kept thinking we needed to get past something first. Some threat, some operation, some piece of business that needed resolving before I could justify stepping back from it for long enough to take you somewhere peaceful." A beat. "I was always waiting for the right time." Martha was quiet. "There was never a right time," he said. "That was the lesson I was too slow to learn." In the basket between them, Naomi made a small sound, not a cry, just a murmur, the vocal equivalent of turning over in sleep. Martha's hand moved to her automatically, palm resting warm against the blanket. "She does that," Marvis said from the other side. "She's been doing it since she was born. Little sound every 20 minutes, like she's checking that everyone's still there." Ji-hoon looked at his daughter. At the small face relaxed in sleep, entirely trusting, entirely certain of being held. "Smart girl," he said quietly. Martha looked at him, looking at Naomi. And something in her expression shifted, some final piece of the careful distance she'd been maintaining since he'd walked into the hospital room, some last remnant of the 8 months releasing. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The estate emerged from the mountain road the way it always did, gradually, like something the landscape had grown rather than built. Stone walls first, then the gate, then the main house visible through the trees as the car rounded the final curve, low roof lines, traditional timber framing, the garden still winter bare but structured and calm in the grey morning light. Martha's breath shifted when she saw it. Ji-hoon noticed. "It's beautiful," Marvis said from the back seat, with the unguarded candor of someone who hadn't prepared a more restrained reaction. Martha said nothing. But she was looking at the house with an expression that Ji-hoon understood, because he had felt something similar the first time he'd stood on the property alone after the divorce, the particular grief of a beautiful thing seen too late. Of standing in a future that should have been a present. The cars pulled through the gate. Staff appeared, a housekeeper Ji-hoon had called ahead, 2 additional security personnel taking positions at the perimeter. The main door was open, warm light spilling out onto the stone path. Ji-hoon helped Martha out of the car. She stood for a moment in the cold morning air, one hand on the car door, looking up at the house. Her breath made small clouds in front of her. The garden was still and silent around them. Somewhere in the trees above the north wall, a single bird was beginning its morning. "You bought this during our marriage," she said. "Not a question." 3 months after our wedding, he said. "And you never brought me here." "No." She turned to look at him. The morning light was honest and unfiltered, and it showed everything. The exhaustion in his face, the 26 hours of sleeplessness, the particular quality of a man stripped down to something essential by a night that had taken everything he'd thought was settled and rebuilt it from the ground. "Why are you showing it to me now?" she asked. "Because now is the only time I have left," he said. "I spent 2 years waiting for a right time that wasn't coming. I'm done waiting." Martha looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the house, exhaled slowly, and said, "Show me where Naomi will sleep." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resolution. It was something more pragmatic and more honest than either, a woman deciding that forward was the only direction available, and choosing to move in it. Ji-hoon reached into the car for Naomi's basket. He carried his daughter inside for the first time. The house settled into a fragile domestic rhythm within the hour. Marvis claimed the bedroom closest to the nursery with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had been operating on no sleep and intended to address that immediately. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Cho who had worked the property for 4 years and had the particular gift of being completely unrattled by anything, produced food and clean towels and a Moses basket for Naomi with a speed that suggested she had been on standby for exactly this scenario. Martha fed Naomi in the main bedroom, the master, which Ji-hoon had shown her to without ceremony or negotiation, because there was no other room in the house that had been built for her in the way that one had, even if she hadn't known it was being built. She sat in the chair by the window overlooking the east garden, and she fed her daughter in the early morning light, and Ji-hoon sat on the edge of the bed across from her and watched the mountains. Neither of them spoke for a long time. It was, Ji-hoon thought, the most peaceful 20 minutes he had experienced in 8 months. Possibly longer. Then his phone lit up. He glanced at the screen. Expected Taeyong. Expected an update on Kwang-soo's building, on Jang's movements, on the 3 territories that Kwang-soo's operation had attempted to destabilize in the early hours of the morning. The message was not from Taeyong. It was from an unknown number. And it was addressed not to Ji-hoon's phone. It was on Martha's. She felt it before he said anything, the shift in his atmosphere, the quality of his stillness changing from the peaceful kind to the other kind. She looked up from Naomi. "What?" she said. "Your phone," he said. "Where is it?" "In my bag." "Why?" "Don't touch it yet." He was already moving, already pulling on the thin surgical gloves he kept out of habit in his coat pocket, already crossing to the bag on the dresser and extracting the phone with the careful deliberateness of a man treating an object as evidence. The screen was lit. The message notification was visible without unlocking it. 7 words. "I know where you are. I'm watching." Ji-hoon read it twice. Set the phone down. Walked to the window. Scanned the garden, the tree line, the stone walls, the gate at the end of the drive. Everything looked exactly as it should. Everything was wrong. Ji-hoon. Martha's voice was controlled but stripped of everything except the need to understand. "What does it say?" He turned from the window. Looked at her, at Naomi still nursing, at Martha's face, at the specific quality of fear in her eyes that was not fear for herself. He told her. Martha closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, something had hardened there. Not panic. Something older. The particular resolve of a woman who had been afraid of this man for years and had spent years building distance from him, and had just discovered that the distance had never been as great as she'd believed. "He has my number," she said. "He's had it for months," Ji-hoon said. "Probably since not long after the divorce. He's been watching you for longer than we knew." "The estate. He can't know this location." Ji-hoon said it with certainty, then immediately interrogated the certainty. "This property is registered through 3 shell companies. There's no connection to my name on any public record. He couldn't have followed us. I had 2 tail cars watching the route the entire way." "Then how?" "The phone," Ji-hoon said. "Your phone." The implication landed in the room. "He's been tracking me through my phone," Martha said slowly. "The whole time. Since the divorce. Possibly before." Ji-hoon picked up the device again. Turned it over. "He didn't need to follow the car. He's had your location continuously." Martha looked at the phone in his hands. At the object she'd carried for 8 months, that she'd used to make appointments and call Marvis and order groceries and research baby names in the small hours of the morning when she couldn't sleep, that had been, the entire time, a window someone else was looking through. "How long has he known about the estate?" she asked. "Since we arrived." Ji-hoon set the phone on the dresser, face down. "Long enough to send a message. Not long enough to have anyone in position." He said this with confidence he was already testing against everything he knew about Hoon Jang, the patience of the man, the planning, the months of preparation he'd applied to the hospital operation. "But that will change." He pulled out his own phone. Texted Taeyong the message, word for word. Then, "Sweep the perimeter. Full sweep. Check tree lanes north and east. And get me a technical team here within the hour. I need Martha's phone examined and cleaned." The response came in under a minute. "Already moving. ETA on tech team 40 minutes. Ji-hoon looked at Martha. She had finished feeding Naomi and was holding her now, the baby's cheek against her collarbone, one hand spread across the small back. Her eyes were on Ji-hoon with the steady measuring quality of a woman running calculations. "You said he can't have anyone in position yet," Martha said. But you're not certain. No, Ji-hoon said. I'm not certain. She appreciated that. He could see it, the small shift of a person who has been given honesty when they expected management. So what do we do? You stay in this room. Marvis stays with you. I'm going to walk the perimeter with Taeyong, and then I'm going to make some calls that will significantly shorten the amount of time Hoonjang remains a problem. He held her gaze. I need you to trust me for the next several hours. I already told you I would. I know. I'm asking again because the situation has changed and I want you to make the choice with current information rather than the information you had 2 hours ago. Martha looked at him for a long moment. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 years, she said. Ji-hoon absorbed this without flinching. I have a lot of ground to make up. Yes, she said simply. You do. He crossed to the door. Stopped with his hand on the frame, the same gesture, the same pause, as the hospital corridor. Martha noticed. He could tell she noticed. The message, she said. I'm watching. He wanted me to be afraid. Yes. He wanted me to feel like there's no distance I can put between us that's far enough. Yes. Martha looked down at Naomi. At the sleeping weight of her daughter against her chest. When she looked back up, the fear was still there. Ji-hoon would have trusted her less if it wasn't, because only fools and people with no imagination weren't afraid of Hoonjang, but it was contained now. Organized. The fear of a person who had decided exactly what they intended to do with it. Tell him, Martha said quietly, that he miscalculated. Ji-hoon looked at her. Tell him, she continued, that I spent 8 months alone and afraid and I'm done. I am done being afraid of him. He can come if he wants to. But he should know what he's walking into. Ji-hoon held her gaze for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one she'd seen on his face since the operating room. Something that acknowledged, without words, that the woman sitting in that chair with their daughter against her chest was one of the most formidable people he had ever known. I'll tell him, Ji-hoon said. He walked out. The perimeter sweep took 22 minutes. Taeyong ran it with 6 men, moving through the garden and the tree lanes and the outer wall with a systematic thoroughness of people who understood that missing something was not an option. Ji-hoon walked the east wall himself, the section closest to the road, his eyes reading the ground and the vegetation and the angles with the practiced attention of a man who had learned, a long time ago, that safety was a discipline rather than a condition. They found nothing. No evidence of recent presence in the tree lanes, no disturbance at the wall, no vehicle on the mountain road that didn't belong there. Jang had sent the message from wherever he was tracking Martha's phone signal, somewhere in the city probably, somewhere he felt secure. The message was a pressure tactic. A demonstration that distance didn't protect her. Ji-hoon had dealt with pressure tactics before. He made 3 calls while Taeyong completed the sweep. The first was to a man named Song who handled digital forensics for Ji-hoon's organization, a quiet, meticulous person who could extract the history of a device with the same unhurried thoroughness he applied to everything and who would, Ji-hoon knew, find exactly what had been installed on Martha's phone and trace it as far back as it could be traced. The second was to a contact inside Seoul's telecommunications infrastructure, a person who owed Ji-hoon a favor of the kind that didn't expire and who could, with the right request, identify the location from which a specific message had been sent to within 50 meters. The third call was the one that mattered most. It was to a man named Cheol, who ran the Eastern Network, a vast and largely invisible web of informants, contacts, and observers who knew the movements of Seoul's criminal ecosystem the way a weather system knows the shape of a landscape. Ji-hoon gave him Hoonjang's description, his known associates, his last confirmed location, and a single instruction. Find him. Don't touch him. Tell me where he is. Then he walked back inside. The technical team arrived 38 minutes later, 2 people with the kind of equipment that looked unremarkable in their bags and was anything but. They worked on Martha's phone at the kitchen table while Mrs. Cho produced coffee and pretended not to notice what was happening with the practiced serenity of a woman who had worked this property for 4 years and had learned that some things were better not noticed. Ji-hoon stood in the doorway of the main bedroom. Martha had moved from the chair to the bed, Naomi asleep beside her in the Moses basket. Marvis was cross-legged on the far side of the bed, her own phone out, doing something with the focused concentration of a person who had decided that staying useful was the best available response to a situation they couldn't control. Martha looked up when Ji-hoon appeared. Anything. The sweep came back clean. The technical team is working on your phone now. We should have a location for the message within the hour. And then I go to work. Martha studied him. You haven't slept. I'll sleep when it's over, yes. You said. She reached across to the small table beside the bed and picked up the coffee Mrs. Cho had left earlier. Held it out toward him. Sit down for 20 minutes. You're not going anywhere for 20 minutes and you know it. Ji-hoon looked at the coffee. At Martha's extended hand. At the absolutely non-negotiable quality of her expression. He crossed the room and sat in the chair by the window. She put the coffee on the arm of the chair. He picked it up. For a moment the room was simply quiet. Martha and Naomi and Marvis and Ji-hoon and the mountain morning outside the window, the garden beginning to take on color as the sun cleared the ridge to the east. The first real light of the day, honest and unhurried, falling across the stone path and the winter garden and the house that had been built for a future that was only now, 8 months late and through considerable damage, beginning to look possible. She has your hands, Martha said quietly, looking at Naomi. Ji-hoon looked at his daughter. At the small fists loosely curled in sleep. God help her, Marvis murmured from the other side of the bed. Martha laughed. It was small and tired and entirely genuine. The laugh of a woman who had been through a night that should have broken her and hadn't. The laugh of someone who had come out the other side of something enormous and found, against reasonable expectation, that she was still herself. Still capable of laughing. Ji-hoon listened to it. Held it the way he held things he understood he would need later. His phone buzzed. Cheol. Got him. Mapo District. Apartment building on Wowsanaro. 3rd floor. He's been there since approximately 0500. One associate with him. Confirmed stationary. Ji-hoon read it twice. Set the coffee down. Stood. Martha's eyes came up. She read his face with the immediate accuracy of a woman who had spent 2 years learning it. You have him. Close, Ji-hoon said. I know where he is. Marvis looked between them with the wide eyes of someone who had, over the course of the last 12 hours, substantially revised her understanding of what Martha's ex-husband did for a living. Martha held Ji-hoon's gaze. Be careful, she said. Always. That's a lie, she said, but I appreciate the effort. He looked at her one more time, at Naomi sleeping between them, at the mountain light through the window, at the particular expression on Martha's face that he had been carrying in his memory for 8 months like a wound that wouldn't close and was only now, in this room, beginning to feel like something different. Something that could heal, if given the chance. I'll be back before she wakes up, he said. Martha nodded. Hold on to that. Ji-hoon walked out of the bedroom. Down the corridor. Through the main door of the estate and into the cold morning air where Taeyong and 4 men were waiting by the vehicles, already understanding from the quality of Ji-hoon's stride that the 20 minutes were over. Mapo District, Ji-hoon said. Wowsanaro. I'll brief you in the car. They moved. Behind him, the estate sat quiet and still in the mountain morning. Inside it, a woman who had survived 8 months alone was holding a sleeping child in a house that had been built for her without her knowledge, in a future that had refused to give up on itself even when everyone inside it had. Ahead, through Seoul's waking streets, a man who had spent years treating Martha Wells as something he was owed was about to discover exactly what it meant to have made that calculation in the wrong city. About to discover what it meant to have made it about the wrong woman. About to discover, in the most definitive terms available, what happened when Hoon Jang finally ran out of distance to hide behind. The drive to Mapo District took 19 minutes. Ji-hoon spent 17 of them completely silent. In the last 2, he made one final call. Not to Taeyong. Not to Cheol. Not to any of the network of people who moved when Ji-hoon Kim moved. To Kwang-soo Lim's personal number. It rang 4 times. Then, Kim. Kwang-soo's voice, careful and controlled, the voice of a man who had been waiting for this call and had decided in advance to sound as though he hadn't. Ji-hoon said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, I'm going to give you until tonight to decide how this ends. Call me at 9. He hung up. The car turned onto Wowsanaro. And the last phase of the night that had started with a phone call at 3:07 a.m. began. The apartment building on Wowsanaro was the kind of structure that existed in every major city, functional, anonymous, designed to house people who needed somewhere to be without being noticed about it. 6 floors of gray concrete and uniform windows, a lobby with a broken intercom panel and a door that a determined person could open without a key if they knew which corner to push. The kind of building that swallowed people whole and gave nothing back. Hoon Jang had chosen it carefully. Ji-hoon could see that immediately. 3 exits. 2 stairwells. A rooftop access door that opened onto an adjacent building if you needed a secondary route out. The main entrance faced a street busy enough that arriving vehicles didn't register as unusual, but narrow enough that a surveillance team would be obvious. It was, by the standards of a man preparing a position he might need to leave quickly, a considered choice. It was not, by the standards of Ji-hoon Kim's organization, adequate. 3rd floor, Taeyong confirmed, his phone showing the building schematic they'd pulled in the car. Unit 304. East side. Window faces the rear courtyard. Cheol's man. In the cafe across the street. Confirmed Jang entered at 0512 and hasn't come out. 1 associate, male 30s, no confirmed ID yet. Ji-hoon studied the building from the car. Thought through the geometry of it, the exits, the angles, the specific mathematics of containing 2 people in a 3rd-floor apartment without producing the kind of noise that brought police to a building in Mapo district at 7 in the morning. I go in alone, he said. Taeyong turned to look at him. Ji-hoon. 2 men on each exit. 1 on the rooftop access. Cheol's man stays across the street and watches the windows. He held Taeyong's gaze. I go in alone. That's. I'm aware of what it is. He opened the car door. If I'm not out in 20 minutes, you come in. Until then, you hold position. He didn't wait for the argument he could see forming. He was already out of the car, already moving across the street with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who belonged in every space they entered, already pushing through the lobby door before Taeyong had finished reaching for his phone. The stairwell smelled of cooking and old carpet. Ji-hoon took it 1 floor at a time, unhurried, listening to the building around him. A television somewhere above. A door closing on the 2nd floor. The specific acoustic quality of a structure containing people who were all pretending not to hear each other. 3rd floor. A corridor with 4 units. Unit 304 at the far end, a thin line of light visible under the door. Ji-hoon stood outside it for a moment. He wasn't armed. He had made the decision deliberately in the car, as a choice about what kind of confrontation this was going to be. Not because he was without access to weapons. There were 4 men in the street below who between them carried enough to resolve the situation in 11 seconds. But because walking through that door with a gun would produce a particular kind of encounter, and what Ji-hoon needed from Hoon Jang this morning was not a particular kind of encounter. He needed the truth. All of it. The parts Mavis's phone hadn't shown him. The parts that had been building for years before photographs and divorces and a pregnancy hidden in a city of 10 million people. He needed to understand the full shape of what had been done to Martha. Not just the mechanics, but the depth of it, the duration, the specific decisions that had been made about her life by people who believed she had no one standing close enough to stop them. He knocked. A silence. Then movement. Then a voice, low and cautious. Who is it? Ji-hoon said nothing. Another silence. Longer this time. The particular silence of a man on the other side of a door running calculations, checking windows, reaching the conclusion that whoever was outside already knew he was there or they wouldn't be knocking. The door opened. Hoon Jang was shorter than Ji-hoon had expected. This was irrational. He had a file on the man, had seen photographs, had known his height and build and approximate age for 3 years, but somehow the idea of him had grown larger than the reality. Jang was 41, lean, with a kind of careful grooming that communicated attention to presentation, and eyes that moved immediately and with professional speed across Ji-hoon's face, his hands, the corridor behind him. The calculation in those eyes was rapid and thorough. Ji-hoon watched it happen. Watched Jang assess the absence of weapons, the absence of visible backup, the fact that the most dangerous man in Seoul had knocked on his door alone at 7 in the morning and was standing in the corridor with his hands at his sides and an expression of complete, unhurried patience. Watched Jang decide that this was either the safest or the most dangerous version of this encounter, and that he couldn't tell which. Kim, Jang said. Jang, Ji-hoon replied. A beat. You'd better come in, Jang said. The apartment was spare and functional, a living area, a small kitchen, a bedroom door closed to the left. The associate Taeyong had mentioned was visible immediately, a man in his 30s sitting at the kitchen table, hands flat and visible, with a carefully neutral expression of someone who had been briefed in advance to stay exactly that way. He looked at Ji-hoon and did not move. Ji-hoon looked at him once. Then back at Jang. "Ask him to wait in the bedroom," Ji-hoon said. Jang studied him for a moment. Then nodded to the associate, who stood without comment and closed the bedroom door behind him. Jang sat on the sofa. Ji-hoon remained standing, which was deliberate, not a power play specifically, but a refusal to allow the encounter to settle into anything that resembled comfort. "You found me faster than I expected," Jang said. "You sent a message from a tracked device to a woman I was already watching," Ji-hoon said. "That wasn't difficult." Jang's jaw tightened slightly. "I wanted her to know I could find her. I know what you wanted," Ji-hoon said. "You wanted her afraid. You've been wanting that for years. The question I came here to ask is why?" "Why?" Jang repeated the word with the particular inflection of a man who finds it insufficient. "She left me. She built a life somewhere else. She married you." He said the last word with a specific quality, not anger exactly, something more corrosive than anger. Something that had been sitting in him for a long time, oxidizing. "She chose a criminal over a man who controlled her," Ji-hoon said. "Who isolated her from her friends, monitored her movements, made her feel that his approval was the condition of her safety. Who, when she left, spent years finding ways to remind her that leaving wasn't as final as she thought." He held Jang's gaze. "I know what you were. I know what you did to her. I read the file 3 years ago and I have not forgotten a single line of it." Jang's expression shifted. "You read?" "The day after our wedding," Ji-hoon said. "I wanted to understand everything she'd survived before she met me. I wanted to know exactly who she'd had to become to get out, and what it had cost her." A pause. "I also wanted to know if you were going to be a problem. And I concluded that you'd been handled." Ji-hoon said it without inflection. "That was my error." Jang stared at him. Something moved across his face, an emotion Ji-hoon couldn't immediately name, something layered in the way of feelings that have been compressed for a very long time. Then, with the abruptness of a man who has decided to say the thing he's been building toward, "She never loved you." Ji-hoon said nothing. "Whatever she told you, whatever she made you believe, she was running. From me, from everything that reminded her of me. She didn't choose you. She chose distance. And you were the furthest thing from her previous life that she could find." Ji-hoon looked at him for a long moment. "That might be true," he said. "In the beginning." Jang blinked. "What she felt in the beginning and what she felt 2 years later are different things," Ji-hoon continued, his voice carrying none of the heat the words might have warranted. "People who begin relationships in flight sometimes discover, when they stop running, that the person beside them is someone they would have chosen anyway. From anywhere. Under any circumstances." He paused. "Martha is not a woman who stays anywhere she doesn't choose to stay. You know that better than anyone." Jang's face did something complicated. "She was carrying my child," Ji-hoon said. "Alone. In a city. She had every reason to leave Korea entirely. Her family is elsewhere, her options were open, no one was holding her here. She stayed." A beat. "Why do you think she stayed?" The question hung in the room. Jang didn't answer it. He looked away for the first time, toward the window, toward the gray morning outside, and Ji-hoon could see in his profile the architecture of a man who had constructed an entire narrative around a woman's life without ever considering that the woman inside that narrative had her own reasons for her own choices. "Tell me about Kwang-soo," Ji-hoon said, shifting. The change of direction worked. Jang's eyes came back, recalibrating. "He contacted me 14 months ago," Jang said, after a pause that measured the distance between what he prepared to say and what Ji-hoon had just made him feel. "He knew about my history with Martha. He said he could get her back to me, that if your marriage was destroyed, she'd have no one in Seoul, she'd be isolated and vulnerable and he stopped. She'd come back to you," Ji-hoon said. "Yes." "And you believed him?" "I wanted to believe him," Jang said. The correction was quiet and Ji-hoon thought, the most honest thing he'd said since the door opened. "There's a difference." Ji-hoon looked at him. At the man who had spent years following Martha at a distance she couldn't see, who had entered an alliance with a criminal organization not for money or power or territory, but for the chance to have returned to him a woman who had made it comprehensively clear that she did not want to be returned. Who had convinced himself, in the particular way of men like him, that her clarity on this point was an obstacle to be overcome rather than a decision to be respected.
What was the plan? Ji-hoon said. After the hospital. If you'd gotten her out of the building. What was the plan? Jang's jaw worked. I was going to take her somewhere safe. Where? Somewhere Kwang-soo's people couldn't find her, somewhere you couldn't. Where, Jang? Outside the country, Jang said. I had documents. A place arranged. I was going to, he stopped again.
You were going to take a woman who had just given birth, Ji-hoon said very quietly, from a hospital against her will, without her child, to a location outside the country.
Each phrase landed separately. That was your plan. The room held the words. Jang said nothing.
And in his silence, Ji-hoon could see the precise moment a man hears his own intentions described accurately by someone else and encounters, possibly for the first time, the full shape of what those intentions actually were.
She would have understood, Jang said. But the conviction had gone out of it. It was the voice of a man reaching for something he'd already dropped. No, Ji-hoon said. She wouldn't have. He straightened. And somewhere underneath everything you've told yourself about what you were doing and why, you know that. Silence.
A long, specific silence of the kind that Ji-hoon had learned over 14 years of complicated encounters to simply allow.
To not fill.
To let sit in the room until it had done whatever work it needed to do.
Jang was looking at his own hands. What happens now, he said finally. The bravado was completely gone.
What was left was something smaller and more human and considerably less dangerous. A man confronting the arithmetic of a situation he had convinced himself he controlled and had not, in fact, controlled at any point.
Ji-hoon considered the question.
He thought about what the answer to this question usually was, in encounters like this one. He thought about the basement storage room and the man zip-tied to a chair. He thought about the efficient and permanent resolutions that his world applied to problems of this particular category. Then he thought about Martha in the mountain estate with their daughter against her chest, saying I am done being afraid of him.
You're going to give me everything, Ji-hoon said. Every communication with Kwang-soo.
Every plan, every contact, every detail of the operation from the day he called you 14 months ago to this morning.
You're going to record it. All of it. And then you're going to leave Korea. Jang looked up. Tonight, Ji-hoon said. Permanently.
You're going to take whatever you have in that bedroom, and you're going to get on a plane, and you're going to build a life somewhere that isn't within reach of Martha Wells or her daughter. And if you ever attempt contact, through any channel, through any intermediary, through any mechanism I haven't anticipated, I will find out about it within 48 hours.
A pause. You've seen enough of how I operate to know that's not a threat. It's a description of how things work. Jang stared at him. Why not just, he stopped.
Because Martha doesn't need your disappearance on her conscience, Ji-hoon said. She's spent enough time managing the weight of things that weren't her fault. She gets to raise her daughter without carrying that.
He held Jang's gaze. This isn't mercy.
This is a decision made on her behalf, for her benefit.
Don't mistake it for anything else. Jang was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. The recording took 40 minutes.
Jang talked with the methodical exhaustion of a man unburdening himself of something he'd been carrying for over a year. Every call with Kwang-soo, every plan, every contingency, every contact within Ji-hoon's organization that Kwang-soo had cultivated as part of the longer operation against his empire.
Some of what he said Ji-hoon already knew. Some of it was new and immediately valuable.
All of it was captured on Ji-hoon's phone and backed up to 3 separate secure locations before Jang finished speaking.
When it was done, Ji-hoon stood. There's a flight to Bangkok at 11:40, he said. Be on it. He walked out of the apartment. Down the stairs. Through the lobby.
Out into the Mapo morning where Taeyong was waiting on the pavement with the expression of a man who had spent 22 minutes outside a building he was not allowed to enter and had profound feelings about it.
Clean? Taeyong asked. Clean. Jang. Handled. Ji-hoon kept walking toward the car. Get me Kwang-soo's building.
I want eyes on every exit and I want a full accounting of everyone who goes in or out between now and 9 tonight.
You're still going to take the 9 o'clock call? Yes. He'll use the time to prepare. I know, Ji-hoon said. So will I.
He was back at the estate before Naomi woke up. He had promised that, and he kept it, which felt like the smallest possible beginning of something that needed much larger gestures to follow, but beginnings were what they were, and Ji-hoon had learned this morning that the only thing to do with a beginning was to show up for it.
Martha was in the garden when he arrived.
She had found a coat from somewhere, one of Ji-hoon's, too large for her, hanging off her shoulders, and she was standing on the stone path in the pale late morning sun with Naomi held carefully against her chest, showing her daughter the winter garden with the quiet narration of a new mother introducing the world one small piece at a time.
Ji-hoon stood at the main door and watched them.
Martha felt him, that same attunement, that same instinctive awareness of his presence in her atmosphere, and turned.
She looked at his face. Read it the way she read everything.
Then she looked back at the garden and continued her quiet narration to Naomi, who was awake and blinking at the pale sky with the profound attention of someone encountering light for approximately the third time.
Ji-hoon crossed the garden. He stood beside her. Jang? Martha asked. Gone. He won't contact you again. A pause. Gone how? On a plane, Ji-hoon said. Alive. I thought that was what you'd prefer. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. Thank you.
They stood together in the winter garden.
Naomi blinked at the sky.
A bird moved through the bare branches of the tree along the north wall, indifferent to everything below it.
And tonight? Martha asked. Kwang-soo.
Tonight, Ji-hoon said, he calls me at 9.
And I give him the choice. What choice?
The same one I gave Jang.
Everything he has, on record. Every detail of what he did.
And then he walks away from Seoul and stays walked away.
Ji-hoon paused.
Or he doesn't take the offer, and I use everything Jang gave me this morning to make the remaining organizations in this city extremely interested in his whereabouts.
Martha turned to look at him. You think he'll take it?
Kwang-soo is pragmatic, Ji-hoon said.
He'll run the numbers.
He'll see that his operation is dismantled, that Jang is gone, that I have a recording with enough detail to make him a target for every organization he double-crossed during this.
He'll take it. And if he doesn't? Ji-hoon looked at her directly. Then it ends differently. Martha held his gaze.
Accepted this without asking him to be something he wasn't.
Okay, she said quietly.
They stood a little longer in the garden.
I need to tell you something, Martha said. Tell me.
When I found out I was pregnant, I was 7 weeks.
I sat in a clinic bathroom for 40 minutes. She looked down at Naomi.
And the thing that terrified me most wasn't being alone. It wasn't being in a foreign country or not having money or not knowing how labor worked.
She paused.
It was the thought that if I told you and you wanted to be involved, and then something happened to you, I would have to explain to our child why their father was gone. I would have to be the person who told them that the world their father lived in had eventually done what those worlds always do.
Ji-hoon listened. I wasn't protecting her from you, Martha said. I was protecting her from losing you. Because I already knew what losing you felt like. And I didn't want that to be the first thing she knew about love. The garden was very quiet. Ji-hoon looked at his daughter.
At the small face turning toward his voice with the unfocused, earnest attention of a person who is new to the world and is doing their absolute best to understand it.
He put his arm around Martha's shoulders.
She leaned into him, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just the small significant weight of a person who has been holding themselves upright alone for a very long time and has decided, in this moment, in this garden, on this cold morning, to put some of that down.
I'm going to change things, Ji-hoon said. The organization. The empire.
I've been building toward legitimate for 3 years. I've been moving money, building structures, making arrangements.
It was always meant to be a transition. I was always going to make the shift eventually. He paused. I was waiting for the right time.
Martha made a sound that might have been a laugh.
You and your right times. I know. He held her closer. I'm done waiting for them. I'm making the time right. Martha looked up at him.
At the face she had memorized and tried to forget and found repeatedly that she couldn't. At the man who had walked into a hospital at 3 a.m. because a stranger had told him to come and he had not hesitated for a single second.
That's going to take a long time, she said. Yes, he agreed. It is. And it's going to be complicated. Profoundly.
And there are going to be conversations we still need to have.
Hard ones. I know. And I'm not, she stopped. Started again. I'm not saying yes to anything yet. I'm saying I'm here.
I'm saying I'm willing to see what this looks like when it isn't a crisis.
Ji-hoon looked at her. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough.
Naomi, apparently having strong opinions about being held between two adults who were not paying sufficient attention to her, made the small checking sound that Marvis had described in the car, the 20-minute pulse of a child confirming that the world was still in place.
Both of them looked at her simultaneously. Then at each other. She has your timing, Martha said.
Ji-hoon looked at his daughter, at the small face organizing itself around the enormous project of existing, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific quality of a future that he wanted to move toward rather than simply survive.
Good, he said. At 9:03 that evening, Kwang-soo Lim called. Ji-hoon answered on the second ring.
He was in the study of the mountain estate, the door closed, the monitors showing the perimeter feeds in 6 small windows along the wall.
Taeyong was outside. Martha and Naomi were down the corridor.
The house was quiet in the particular way of a building that had been waiting all day for something to resolve.
Kim. Kwang-soo's voice was controlled. Careful.
The voice of a man who had spent the day running numbers and had arrived at an answer he didn't love but could accept.
Kwang-soo, Ji-hoon said. A pause. How much does Jang have? Everything. Another pause, longer this time. I'll need 48 hours to make arrangements. You have 24.
A silence that measured the distance between what Kwang-soo wanted to negotiate and what Ji-hoon was prepared to offer.
24, Kwang-soo said finally.
My people will contact you in the morning with instructions for the recording.
When it's done and verified, you leave.
If you're in Seoul 48 hours from now, I release what Jang gave me to every organization you've been running angles against for the last 5 years.
Ji-hoon's voice was even and unhurried and entirely absolute. We understand each other? We understand each other. Ji-hoon ended the call. He sat for a moment in the quiet study.
Outside the window the mountain was dark, the garden invisible, the city's glow a faint suggestion on the horizon. Somewhere in those streets, 2 men who had spent over a year dismantling his life were now making the pragmatic calculations of people who had lost and knew it.
It wasn't entirely over.
There were pieces still to move, details still to close, the long careful work of transition and legitimacy still ahead. There would be other threats, other calculations, other mornings that required the version of him that had been built in 14 years of rooms like this one. But tonight, the specific war that had started with fabricated photographs and a divorce he should have fought harder against and 8 months of silence that had contained, without his knowledge, the most important thing in his life, tonight, that war was finished.
Ji-hoon turned off the study light. Walked down the corridor. Pushed open the door to the main bedroom.
Martha was in bed, Naomi in the Moses basket beside her, both of them asleep in the warm lamplight with a complete and absolute peace of people who had decided for tonight that the world outside could manage itself.
Ji-hoon stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he crossed the room. Sat in the chair by the window.
Looked at his daughter, and at the woman who had carried her alone through 8 months of fear and love and extraordinary quiet courage. He had built an empire on the principle that power was the only thing worth having. He looked at what was in front of him. He had been wrong about that for a long time. He was done being wrong about it. He didn't sleep immediately. He sat in the chair and watched the 2 of them breathe, and listened to the mountain quiet outside, and thought about the future, not the kind he'd been building for 14 years, but a different kind entirely.
Smaller in some ways. Larger in every way that mattered.
Naomi made her sound at some point, the small 20-minute check, the pulse of a child making sure the world was still in place.
Ji-hoon leaned forward in his chair. Still here, he said quietly. She settled. And for the first time in 8 months, so did he.